Shabbat Shalom. I did not expect to be explaining the idea of a biblical type scene to my 10-year-old while driving through a Christmas light display, but there we were on a Saturday night in Woodland Hills. Now, amongst my friends, and now all of you as well, my love of Christmas music, and I don't actually mean the commercialized stuff, is quite well known. Even though, and maybe especially because it's not my belief, I am deeply moved by the messages of love and faith and hope and grace that traditional Christmas carols bring, and I have deeply fond memories of singing them year after year with friends. It turns out, though, that among the many incredible benefits of a Jewish day school education, it turns out that a comprehensive knowledge of Christmas music is not one of them. And so I took it upon myself to provide some of that formative education as we sat in a traffic jam waiting to enter Candy Cane Lane. So then, somewhere between dodging questions about the virgin birth, the difference between Jesus and a Greek demigod, thank you, Percy Jackson, and other topics for which my rabbinical school degree really did not equip me to answer with authority, we stumbled upon one finally that I could explain. Who, my son wanted to know, was the angel Gabriel, and how did he appear in the Christmas story? Now, the course that I took was solely about the Hebrew Bible, but I will say that my mind was blown by taking an undergraduate class with Professor Benjamin Summers called The Art of Biblical Narrative. This one's really for you, Rabbi Stern. A student of Professor Robert Alter, Professor Summers introduced me and my classmates to the biblical type scene, a recurrent narrative episode which sort of uses the manipulation of a fixed constellation of predetermined motifs, right? You have sort of object A and B and C, and you kind of move them around to get the scene. And even a cursory reading of Tanakh, and maybe particularly Genesis, which will end tomorrow, will introduce the reader to the same story, often being told 2 or 3 or even more times about different characters, or sometimes even about the same character in different sets of circumstances. There's a lot about wells and going to Egypt happening over and over. There's a reason for that. And just like Hollywood rom-coms or westerns or shootouts, we're supposed to be able then to use context clues and conventions to ascribe and understand the story within a larger cultural, and in the case of a biblical type scene, theological meaning. And of the 6 type scenes that Robert Alter identified, the one that has always interested me the most, maybe because one includes my namesake Sarah, is the Annunciation type scene, where the birth of the hero is announced to his usually infertile mother. You see where I'm going here with my son's question, right? In each story, then, there are 3 main figures. There's the mother-to-be, the person who comes to make the announcement, who's usually an angelic or prophetic figure, and this eventual baby destined for greatness. Sarah is the first, and continues, at least in Tanakh, all the way to Samuel, which is not coincidentally my son's middle name. And guess, given the season, who else fits into this pattern? Now, I guarantee that my 10-year-old was just as enthralled by this deep dive into biblical criticism as you might be. And really, I did not come here on the last Shabbat of 2023 to talk about the birth of Jesus. But I am fascinated by this idea of and language of annunciation, or in more casual parlance, spreading the good word. I spent a lot of time on my most recent trip to Israel chatting with folks, particularly shopkeepers, baristas, etc. Part of it is that I'm always looking for any possible chance to practice my Hebrew and just hear Hebrew spoken. But part of it was also that while Rabbi Yoshi and I had the opportunity to hear from so many distinguished thinkers and meet with victims and families of October 7th, I was also interested in trying to understand the pulse of the country in this moment, to see what people were thinking and hoping for and talking about. So at least once in a conversation, me and my conversation partner would exchange the phrase lo pashut, it's not simple, with a sort of sad head shake, and that repeated over and over. But here's what I noticed more than anything. Normally, when you finish a conversation with someone in Israel, they might say, on a Thursday, they'd say Shabbat Shalom to end the conversation. They might say Yom Tov, have a good day. They might say Todah, thank you. They might say Lehitraot, I'll see you again. But instead, each and every conversation that I had, again, whether with a friend or the shopkeeper, ended with wishes for Besorot Tovot, which we might translate as good tidings. May we seem to wish each other each time, hear good news. So on that trip, Rabbi Yoshi and I landed in Israel just after the first hostages returned home and as the ceasefire had just taken place. Each night that we were there, thousands gathered in Kikar HaChatufim, Hostages Square, to await word on that night's releases. There was literally dancing and singing as families were reunited and familiar faces recognized on screen. And as the week went on, we started to see or feel some normalcy returning, or at least what Israelis call shigat cherum, routine emergency. Then my last moments of El Al check-in were spent being shuffled from place to place as a red alert buzzed on all of our phones because a rocket was headed in the vicinity of Ben Gurion. So now, just about a month after my return, I can tell from my Red Alert app and from talking to friends almost daily that while it might sort of be shigrat cherum, it's not actually normal. Schools are interrupted daily by barrages of rockets. Hundreds of thousands of Israelis are still displaced, living 6, 8, and 10 to a room in hotels not designed for long-term residency. And rather than daily hostage returns or cause for celebration, instead I've seen pictures of signs on the doors of military spouses asking anyone who comes to text or to call them, because a knock on the door is the sign of the worst possible news. So even just a few weeks later, it feels like a different time. And now each day, I find that in the depths of my phone and social media and news apps and red alerts and sad conversations with friends, both here and in Israel, that I keep trying to find Besorot Tovot, this good news. And I've been thinking about it and listening to a lot of podcasts as I've been driving. And so even more than finding good news, I think I'm trying to understand maybe what good news might be in the context of this moment. It's clear that hostages coming home is the good news. But beyond that, because there's a lot of conversation in Israel that says, what news and what change and what objective now is declared good beyond bringing the hostages home. It's not a question for me or in Israel whether it's a just war or a war that needs to be fought. But instead, I'm asking these questions that I heard over dinner tables and those store counters and a lot of cups of coffee. What does it look like and sound like, as Rabbi Daniel Hartman and Yossi Klein Halevi have been asking on their important podcast, when the guns are eventually, we pray soon, maybe, silenced? And I thought to myself as I prepared to stand up tonight, the political scientists and the academics and the generals and the politicians of the world have their ideas, and really the answer is going to be hashed out amongst them. And Israelis certainly have a number of opinions, and it won't surprise you that they are vocal about expressing them. And the world around us, unfortunately, seems to have a pretty clear picture, too, of what it should look like, and that's not one with which I'm willing to live. So I feel like what I can offer, perhaps beyond all that, and as Rabbi Stern started tonight, maybe is a little bit of hope, because I think that's the expertise of our people and our tradition. So back to the end of those Ben Yehuda Street conversations, and this phrase, which until this year was mostly heard in Haredi, or ultra-Orthodox communities and conversations, and honestly rarely as the parting words even there between friends and strangers. Did a little bit of a dive into the origins of this phrase, Besorot Tovot. It appears as early as the Mishnah, which I always say is a book that is all about grief and loss and destruction, but it's most familiar to some of us because it appears in Birkat HaMazon, the blessing after meals, where we pray for the arrival of Elijah the prophet, who will, as the text says, be the harbinger of good news. In naming this phrase, the Hebrew language's expression of the year, a Philologos column comments that the text of Birkat HaMazon goes back to the Talmud, and Elijah, of course, is the harbinger of the Messiah, and a bringer of solace to the downtrodden, so that the saying of Besorot Tovot is both for ultimate redemption and more immediate relief from trials and tribulations. For me, the appearance of the prophet Elijah in the phrase, Elijah, who's known in my book, the Talmud, as the one who will know the unknowable answers and solve the unsolvable challenges, the appearance of Elijah suggests this hope and possibility of a future we cannot even begin to imagine. And in this painful moment and in these terrible months, it seems sometimes like that's what we need more than anything. So back to my son's question, and the news that Elijah is most often thought to harbinge, I don't think that's actually a word, is the birth of a new hero, a messianic figure. Some of my greatest teachers I got to study with last month, Rabbis Micha Goodman and Michael Marmer, Rabbi Tamar Elad Applebaum, and others, they all spoke of their hope in this moment, and they used this language for a rebirth. They said, maybe this is a moment of rebirth. And they said, actually, maybe even more than that, it's the birth of something entirely new. They said maybe it's new vision and new opportunity and new Zionism and a new and reborn Israel. And so I suppose that is my hope for us, maybe individually, and certainly for the Jewish people as we approach 2024. Harachaman, may the merciful one guide us, our leaders and our soldiers, to a future we cannot yet imagine, a future of birth and rebirth, one which brings us Besorot Tovot, good news for today, tomorrow, and far beyond. Shabbat Shalom.